Okay. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Did I turn the microphone on? Okay, very good. Well, my name is Mike Polt. I'm the Senior Director here at the McCain Institute in charge of our Leadership Development Program. And I'd like to start us off with, in case you were not here for this, there's another event down the street that does something totally different, but this is what we're doing here tonight. The new ASU Master's Degree in International Affairs and Leadership. And I thought the best way to start us off is with what our McCain colleagues already have seen before, and that is our starting video about why we are in the arena. So let me see if I can, actually, do you need to help me? By itself. There we go.
It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again. If he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat.
I'm in the arena because we have an opportunity to actually fulfill the dreams of every human that's ever lived.
I'm in the arena because I am a next generation leader.
It's too easy to sit on the margins and look from the outside in.
I am in the arena because I believe there is an opportunity to make a change in my part of the world.
I am in the arena because the society of my nation fails to understand the respect for diversity.
I'm in the arena because human dignity and human rights are worth fighting for.
I fight along with hundreds and thousands of rural women of India.
We need to come together to protect the future generation.
I am in the arena because we need more justice, transparency, accountability, and integrity in public life.
We will not be silenced. We are definitely not going down without a fight.
Keep that faith. Keep your courage. Stick together. Stay strong. Do not yield. Do not flinch. Stand up and fight.
Join me in the arena.
Please 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 join me in the arena.
Join me in the arena.
Please join me and so many others in the arena.
So welcome to the arena in the ASU Barrett and O'Connor Center and the home of the New American University, ASU, and the McCain Institute. At ASU, we define ourselves by whom we, not by whom we exclude, by whom we include, but by whom we include in our master learning enterprise and how they succeed. The motto of the mothership that reflects the motto of the Institute and of this program of the new Master's Degree in International Affairs and Leadership. President Crow is truly a pioneer, not only in the educational field, but a pioneering leader in basically making change happen, and in the process upending the entire concept of what higher education in the United States is all about. And ASU has become the kind of teaching and learning and experiential powerhouse, what we call the ASU enterprise, because of the energy that President Crow has put into the institution. And here is the motto of the McCain Institute, where we are again dedicating ourselves to serving causes greater than ourselves. It's the motto of the new Master's Degree, it's the motto of the Institute, it's the motto of the McCain family through generations in character-driven leadership and in the Institute's mission based on security, economic opportunity, freedom, and human dignity around the world. So, boy, do we need Senator John McCain here right now, and we don't have him. But we do have the things that he's left us, both an inspiration of what he has said, but most importantly, what he's done. One of the things that we ask ourselves here at the McCain Institute every single day is, so what about everything that we do? Point being that unless there's impact, unless there's action related to what we're engaged in, we have to ask ourselves, why are we doing that? And that goes directly for our master's degree in international affairs and leadership. So we welcome you to our newest offering in our leadership development toolkit, this master's degree. We now provide the unique opportunity to earn an advanced degree in making the world a better place. That's what this degree is all about. That's what this degree is going to be delivering. Political turbulence, failed states, conflict and human suffering all have one common denominator: absent or malignant leadership. The McCain Institute developed leaders all share one principal commitment: selfless service, uniting stakeholders, and bridging differences in their own societies and across national boundaries. They make decisive contributions to a world shaken today by too much divisive hubris and too little common enterprise. So our graduates will be prepared to be these kinds of character-driven leaders in the international arena, combining the assets of Arizona State University through its academic expertise and its global reach, the McCain Institute, through the emphasis on character-driven leadership. We are the only degree that I know of in the country that takes international relations and leadership and puts it together and makes leadership part of the overall, is integrated in every part of the curriculum throughout the entire experience. The Washington presence, Michael Crow fought very hard to get this building on the ground right here in a very central location in Washington, D.C., to demonstrate the commitment to the national and the international reach and the leadership that ASU and the McCain Institute want to demonstrate. And our expert faculty, of which you have several participants, members here tonight, and you're soon going to have a conversation by Ambassador John Negroponte, our former colleague and our future colleague in the enterprise of the Master's Degree in International Affairs and Leadership. I'd like to say a few words first about the credit for putting this whole master's degree together to the team that worked so hard to make this enterprise happen by people who, after all, are not academics. I'm not, our program team is not, but they're all dedicated to making this the finest degree in the city, the finest degree in the nation, in which you can prepare yourself for leadership in the international arena as a character-driven leader, and not just simply to advance your own career goals. Not that there's anything wrong with that. So, Program Director, Ambassador Edward O'Donnell, Senior Program Coordinator Ashley Bowers, back there in the red. Senior Program Coordinator Emmanuel Guerrero, over there, sitting over there, who's going to be working intimately with the program. All of them deserve a great round of applause of putting all this program together. And I would be remiss, Ambassador O'Donnell reminded me this evening about saying something about this. Our former executive director here at the McCain Institute, Ambassador Kurt Volker, he was the inspirational guide in saying to us, why don't we do this? And then gave us the leeway, the push, and lent his own weight and energy to coming to this moment tonight. So we're very, very grateful to him for having had the idea, for having taken the initiative for us to be able to offer this to you tonight. I wanted to show you some pictures of some very handsome people. To show you a few of the people who are going to be teaching here at the Institute. Of course, I already mentioned Ambassador John Negroponte, whom I introduced in just a moment. Ambassador O'Donnell, who is the program director. Our former colleague, Matthew Rooney, from the managing director of the Bush Institute at SMU, a former colleague from the State Department. Catherine Novelli. Catherine Novelli was not only Undersecretary for Economic and Business Affairs at the State Department, She worked for Apple for 10 years, Ed? 10 years. She's the woman who brought the iPhone to China. So a rather tremendous accomplishment. Nicholas Rasmussen, our Senior Director here for National Security and Counterterrorism, and now our Acting Executive Director at the moment, a true expert in his field who will be teaching a course directly in the area. And of course, my partner in crime and in leadership development here at the McCain Institute, Lieutenant General Benjamin Frakely, who's a special advisor to the president of ASU for leadership initiatives, and my partner in running and managing our leadership programs here at the McCain Institute. All of them will be having a hand in teaching in our course and many more. A few prospective, at least one prospective future colleague is here as well. Admiral Margaret Kibben, who's sitting there in the third row. Admiral Kibben was the chaplain of the United States Navy, and she had the sad honor and duty to officiate at the funeral of Senator John McCain. And she's with us now working on developing a course that she's uniquely qualified to teach, dealing with religion and international affairs and leadership. So, as I said before, we're very fortunate to have Ambassador John Negroponte here, one of our nation's most senior and most accomplished diplomats, former Deputy Secretary of State and Deputy National Security Advisor, and first Director of National Intelligence. He's going to be joining our faculty starting this January, teaching our course on national security policy. In case you ever want to know anything about national security policy, that's the man to come to. To give you a small taste of the level and the relevance of our discourse on international issues, Ambassador Negroponte's upcoming class and our other course offerings, Ambassador O'Donnell and he will now engage in a conversation right here in front of us on U.S. national security interests, on diplomatic leadership, and about the purpose and the nature and the delivery of the new master's degree in international affairs and leadership. So with that, if I might ask you, please, to take the floor.
Is this working?
We have two. We're in good shape.
One each.
Huh?
Okay. Well, let me water first. Just in case. Thank you, Ambassador Michael Polk, a colleague of mine from the Career Foreign Service, and John Negroponte, Ambassador, and Deputy Secretary Ambassador Polk introduced him as really one of the leaders in the Foreign Service when we were going through our career. And so we were colleagues, Ambassador Michael Polk and myself, through various assignments, but it was always with the guidance of and mentorship of our generation by Ambassador John Negroponte. So it's a real honor for you to be here, Ambassador Negroponte, and I just wanted to add a little bit more about Ambassador Negroponte's distinguished career, because I'm going to ask him some specific questions to draw on that background for those of you who are in the next generation of leaders in our country. And Ambassador Negroponte, here we have Arizona State University current students that I'm teaching. I have some former students here who are one who's working up on Capitol Hill. There's an online ASU student here, and I'm sure there are other college students and those of you who are maybe already in your career and looking for a master's degree to advance your career. And so I think you've got a unique opportunity to talk about history and look to the future, but with the background that Ambassador Negroponte brings to us tonight. So Ambassador Negroponte was ambassador to the United Nations, U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. He was ambassador to Iraq, Philippines, Mexico, Honduras. He held senior policy positions here. And so I almost don't know where to start, but I would like to first give you a chance to say a few words, and then I'm going to ask you a question about your history and experiences and put it together with the McCain principles of leadership. But Ambassador Negroponte.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you, Michael Polt, and thank you to the leadership of Arizona State University for giving me this opportunity, both to appear here tonight, but also, more importantly, to be able to teach one of your classes this upcoming semester. The proverbial answer to knowing where to start is to start at the beginning, but I don't really want to start at the beginning because that goes back almost 60 years, and I could drone on for a long, long time. Suffice it to say, I entered the Foreign Service in October of 1960, which, believe it or not, was the end of the Eisenhower administration. So I caught the tail end of that administration, came in. Our class actually got to observe the first, I guess, televised presidential debates, Kennedy, Nixon. It was really kind of interesting. And our class got together, we were 40 of us, to each time those debates took place. Anyway, fast forward, I had 9 different overseas assignments in the Foreign Service. I had 37 years as a Foreign Service officer until 1997. I retired and went to work in the private sector for 4 years as an executive vice president of the McGraw-Hill Companies, a publishing company. And then President Bush, was totally unexpected by me, and a complete surprise, I was invited to come back into government in 2001 and invited to be our ambassador to the United Nations. And that ended up leading to 4 of the most interesting jobs I had in my career, and I never could have reasonably expected to have. Ambassador to the UN, then ambassador to Iraq, and then first director of national intelligence. And lastly, sort of like going full circle and coming back to where I started, I ended up as the Deputy Secretary of State, which when I entered that building in October of 1960, it was beyond my imagination that I would ever end up working on the 7th floor, having over time worked on every single floor of the State Department, except the 8th floor, which are the ceremonial offices, and you're only up there if you're posthumously, I think, with your portrait or something like that. Anyway, I feel that speaking of trying to relate that to the course that we're going to be offering in January, I feel I have something to share with students from a practitioner's point of view. I'm a complete pragmatist. Obviously, you have to be bound by certain ethical and moral norms as you conduct your life. That's just true of almost any situation. But as far as an approach to foreign policy and national security, I think the pragmatic tradition in the United States has ended up perhaps proving itself to be the wisest course, as opposed to, if you will, more extreme ideological positions, whether to the left or to the right. So I think I have something to share on that score, and about how to be effective abroad, how to get stuff done overseas when you're trying to advance United States interests, recognizing that, even though sometimes we wish it were so, our law does not prevail in these other countries where we serve. And we can't order people what to do. We have to cajole, persuade countries and governments of the merits of our positions and see what we can do to influence things. So that part is extremely interesting. And then, of course, there's just been a number of historical things that have happened over time that we can discuss as well. The last point I make, Ed, before we have our dialogue, is that for me, and I retired from the second time from government at the end of the Bush administration as Deputy Secretary of State, and I left on January 20th when the administration ended, and showed up at the consulting company that I work at now on the 21st of January. I've always hated to have any gap between my previous job and the next one. Almost paranoid about that. But the one thing I taught for 7 years after that at Yale, and then 2 years at GW, and then I had one year affiliation with the University of Virginia. But probably what I've found most rewarding about the experience has always been the mentoring and the dealing with the students themselves, helping them think through their career plans, counseling on this and that kind of issue. And I take that part of what I consider to be my responsibility very, very seriously. And I've also found it a very enjoyable responsibility. And then I've enjoyed following the careers of a number of the people who I taught as long ago as 10 years ago, who are already, some of whom are already rising stars in various parts of the United States government, whether it's the State Department or the intelligence community, or some of them call me up and tell me they're the deputy director of an office in the NSC or in the National Economic Council. I say, wow, you know, bravo. So that's kind of what interests me about teaching, is to help nurture the next generation of our leaders in this kind of business broadly defined, not just foreign service or intelligence or military, but international service of almost any kind, whether it's NGOs or the United Nations, you name it. So religious organizations. So that's a little bit about me and my background and my approach to teaching.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So if I may ask you to take the McCain Institute definition of character-driven leadership, doing the right thing at the right time for the right reasons for a cause greater than yourself. Would you apply that to your distinguished foreign policy background in terms of decisions you were a part of, policy decisions in national security or foreign policy that were successful, and who was responsible for that? Who was the character-driven leader that you would assign credit to for leading that decision?
Right. So as I was thinking about this question, you had given me a heads up as to which questions you were going to ask me. I also applied it in more general terms, that is to say, away from myself, and more in terms of American diplomatic history in recent decades. I'll talk a bit about ones I was involved in as well, but I wanted to mention what I consider to be probably the most important diplomatic accomplishment of my lifetime was, of course, the avoidance of a nuclear exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union in the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, what greater accomplishment of diplomacy could there be? And I commend one book to you. There's a lot of stuff's been written about the Cuban Missile Crisis, but Robert Kennedy, the president's own brother, wrote a very readable book. It's a bit, you know, it's not much longer than Peter Rabbit, and called 13 Days. And it's a good read, and if you don't like it, well, you can't blame me, because it won't take you that much time to read. But it's, I think, a very good account of his experience during that time and how we held the government together, and how these gentlemen, I think they were all gentlemen at the time, were closeted in the White House, and as they worked their way through what to do. But the really important thing to remember about it all is that before we reached a final conclusion, the initial recommendation to the President of the United States, particularly from all of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was to bomb Cuba and invade it. That was going to be the solution. And President Kennedy resisted that idea, and I think he probably thought to himself, and there may be some indication of that in Bobby's book, that, you know, maybe that as a last resort might be a possibility, but he was going to explore the different options. And anyway, the Cuban Missile Crisis, I think, is an incredibly important illustration of the success of diplomacy in avoiding a catastrophic situation. The second one I wanted to cite, and then I can relate it a little bit, you know, I think you've asked me about failures as well, so maybe I can go right on to those. Let me go on to those also.
Okay.
Was the first Gulf War in 1990, when we invaded Kuwait to expel Saddam Hussein's army from Kuwait, which he had invaded in the summer, summer of 1990, am I correct? Yes, and then August, and then we went in in February of the following year. Now, what was really interesting about that situation was that George Herbert Walker Bush had been ambassador to the United Nations. And so he had and he was a quite accomplished diplomat. He'd been both the ambassador to the UN and he'd been the US representative before we had formal diplomatic relations. He'd been the US representative in Beijing. So he had experience with high-level diplomacy. He did not want to go into Iraq without the legitimating imprimatur of a United Nations Security Council resolution. And he insisted on that. And so he made Secretary of State James A. Baker really work to earn his pay. And he went to all the other 14 members of the Security Council and ended up, if I remember correctly, with a 14-2 vote for 2 against and 1 abstention. Importantly, China abstained rather than vetoing. If China had vetoed, then we would have not, the resolution would not have passed. And this was an enormous political and diplomatic success because, first of all, it made it easier for us to get congressional approval of going into Iraq, into Kuwait to rescue that country. And secondly, it meant that, once the Security Council has said, we're authorized to use all appropriate means, that was the language, all necessary means, I think, it gives you a free hand to do pretty much what you want. And probably, since they all voted in favor of it, they're not going to quibble with every detail of how you go about it. So that was a tremendous success, and I think Mr. Bush, 41, and his Secretary of State deserve an enormous amount of credit for having insisted on that. The easier alternative might have been to say, well, look, these guys have behaved so badly, we got to respond quickly, let's go in there and, take care of this situation, and people won't mind as long as we're successful. Well, that brings me to one of, I think, the more significant failures of our diplomacy, which I was directly involved in, and that was the Second Gulf War and the run-up to that war. We started out okay. We were concerned about the reports of Iraq having a WMD capability in the year 2002. And there was sort of a drumbeat about, concern about Saddam Hussein developing WMD and what are we going to do about it. And some preparations started being made for a war with Iraq by President Bush. Some of the planning for that second Gulf War started almost immediately after 9/11. But General Powell, who was then Secretary of State that summer of 2002, persuaded the president that we ought to go to the UN, again, to get some kind of resolution or resolutions to deal with the Iraq question. And so we negotiated very hard, and in November of 2002, we got a really very strong, effective, what we thought would be effective, inspection regime negotiated. We recruited out of retirement a former Prime Minister of Sweden who had also been the director of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Hans Blix, to lead this effort, and we started the inspection process. But the administration was in such a hurry to take the next step, that is to say, to actually go into Iraq, and the buildup of our forces, and that's something I had not fully appreciated when I was working on the question at that time. In retrospect, I learned how much more planning had been done and more preparation had been done for going into Iraq than I had ever realized while I was serving in New York City. And so there was tremendous pressure internally generated on ourselves at the top leadership level to go into Iraq, whether or not we could get that second resolution, that's what it was called, that would authorize the actual use of force. And in February, which I thought was way too soon, that was 2 or 3 months, let's see, December, January, 3 months after we'd passed this new inspection regime. That just was not a reasonable amount of time to allow for effective inspections. I was instructed to table a resolution at the Security Council requesting authorization for the use of force. And all hell broke loose between ourselves, the French, particularly France. It was Jacques Chirac and others. And we had a tumultuous, must have been about a month and a half, where we jockeyed around. We were trying to muster support amongst the unelected members, and so on and so forth. And went back and forth, and somewhat inconclusively, but very dramatic sort of situation with General Powell going up to the Security Council. And maybe some of you have seen these photographs where he's holding up a vial of radioactive or biological weapon of some kind, material, with me and CIA Director George Tenet sitting right behind him, giving a whole expose about Iraq's WMD. But we couldn't get the vote for the resolution. President Chirac said, no, if it does come to a vote, if it's put to a vote by the United States, I will veto it. He finally basically ended the debate, because when one of the permanent members of the Security Council says they'll veto, the discussion is over. So President Bush went into Iraq a few weeks later, a couple of 3 weeks later, but without that legitimating imprimatur of a UN Security Council resolution and a coalition of the willing. And then, of course, it turned out even worse that there were no WMD in Iraq, and we couldn't find any. And they scoured the countryside. And it turned out that actually Saddam didn't have an active WMD program at that time, although he had enjoyed conveying the impression that perhaps he had them, in a way, perhaps as a deterrent to his neighbors and others who might want to take some kind of advantage of Iraq. And so he wanted to keep people guessing as to whether he had nuclear weapons or not. And there may have been people, even in his own political establishment, who thought he had nuclear weapons, but they didn't. And I think that hurt us internationally, and I think it hurt us in terms of domestic support for Iraq. And then we overestimated how long we would end up being involved there. So I know I've droned on too far, and you have other questions for me, Ed.
Well, but if I could just, as a follow-up, the lesson learned for the future, for these young people who will be in decision positions in the future, when the commander-in-chief has to make a military decision, should it be with the United Nations if possible, or coalition willing?
I think the important point is
in terms of U.S. interests.
Well, rather than prescribing, exactly how a president should go about it, I think the point always is exhaust all diplomatic alternatives first. Number two, be sure you line up your ducks, both with the international community and with your domestic constituency, with your Congress. And normally, the way to do that would be to get a Security Council resolution. There may be other ways of doing it, but that's probably one of the more effective ways of doing it. But the main thing is, remember, we're not alone in the international community, and if you antagonize other important, powerful countries, you're going to pay a price in some way or other later on, either in regard to that particular issue or in regard to some other issue. Where they'll come to us and say, "Look, we're not going to help you this time because you didn't pay any attention to what we had to say the last time." That kind of thing. So, international relations involve a certain degree of comedy amongst the different countries involved.
Thank you. Well, I think you've outlined a very important success and I think the Cuban Missile Crisis, or more broadly,
and the first
in our
Gulf
generation,
War.
in the first Gulf War, but no nuclear war in our generation during the whole run of the Cold War. And I think that's important for Americans to know there were successes, and then I think you outlined very directly, but I think from what I read about your role in that, it's in the press that you were arguing as ambassador to Iraq that it's going to take a lot longer to the Secretary of Defense and, the Commander-in-Chief.
I didn't lie down on the railroad tracks and, to object to this, but I did raise a couple of cautionary notes, including publicly. I said that I think this is something that needs to be dealt with great caution. But I basically focused on the job I had to do in New York. I was not a part of the National Security Council, as some UN ambassadors are, and I wasn't an intimate part of the the Washington political process. So I kept to my business up in New York.
Well, and before we leave this theme of character-driven leadership, I want to say on my own behalf, I think you are a character-driven leader in decisions you have made that you haven't mentioned, like NAFTA when you were U.S. Ambassador to Mexico.
My favorite, if I could, pardon me.
Please, open yes.
It was the Montreal Protocol of 1987
right. That's
to protect the stratospheric ozone layer. Some of you may know of this. It was the treaty designed to ban the use of chlorofluorocarbons and chemicals that destroy the ozone layer. And my deputy, Richard Benedict, and he wrote a book about it, and I think we've got it in the syllabus actually, called Ozone Diplomacy. He was the one involved in the negotiation, and he had really the bit in his teeth. He really wanted this thing, and he pushed it very, very hard in this town and internationally. And but it was a very interesting environment, and it's a little bit like the climate change debate today. I mean, the science had been demonstrated. There were two scientists called chemists, a fellow called Roland and a fellow called Molina. Molina's a Mexican scientist. And together, who taught at MIT. And they had conducted a successful experiment that demonstrated that these molecules damaged the ozone layer and were, in fact, the explanation of the developing hole in the Antarctic ozone cover. They always talked about the Antarctic hole. And so NASA and NOAA, two U.S. government agencies, were the ones who provided the scientists that studied this. But Benedict and the scientists, they went to Russia because Russians were doubtful. They went to Japan. They went to the EU. They persuaded them all of the science. They got everybody on board. And so internationally, we were in pretty good shape. But then it turned out we had a science advisor to the president called Dr. William Graham, who was a physicist himself. He didn't believe the science. And he was accompanied in that disbelief by Don Hodel, who was the Secretary of the Interior, and he didn't believe it either. And he told the press that one time at a press conference. And they asked Mr. Hodel, well, look, if you're wrong, what do you recommend that people do if you're not willing to go ahead with this treaty designed to ban these offensive substances? And he said, well, people should use more umbrellas, and they should buy more sunblock. That was, honest to goodness, was his answer to that question in a press conference. And Herblock, who at the time, he's passed away, but he was a very famous cartoonist for the Washington Post. He went to town. Look up Herblock and Hodel with respect to that particular issue. Anyway, so we had resistance from the Interior Department, which was very important on environmental issues, but luckily we had tremendous support, and we didn't give up from the Deputy Secretary of State, John Whitehead, and Secretary George Shultz, who was the Secretary of State at the time, and he persuaded President Reagan that we should sign this agreement. And so in 1987, when the conference in Montreal took place, we signed that convention. And the interesting part about it is once we signed it and it went into force, everybody wanted to implement the terms of it much more rapidly. They thought it was so great that we got very rapid implementation. But what bothers me about this whole thing is that we really haven't had a global, legally binding, universal agreement on these kind of atmospheric issues since 1980. That was more than 32 years ago. And so I think it's about time we think about getting another one. I'm very disappointed in our international environmental negotiating track record in recent years. I think it's been very unfortunate.
And just to fill in the blanks here, that was when you were Assistant Secretary for Oceans
Correct.
Environment at the State Department, and from that position,
Oceans, Environment, and
he
Science.
was able
right.
to move the policy that required.
I had another idea then, but I got called over to become the Deputy National Security Advisor, so I never got to implement it. But my idea was that I was going to try to persuade the administration to launch a forestry initiative. We're still messing around with that idea now. And I don't think have anything that well developed, but I think back in '87 it might have really made sense to have some kind of forestry initiative that dealt both with the tropical forests, because they're concentrated in basically 3 countries, right? Brazil, Indonesia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and then also for afforestation and reforestation of less precious kinds of woods, so that you can, increase the absorption of CO2.
Maybe there's a book there that you can think about for the future with the help of a graduate student.
May I add
Yeah, please,
quick
Ambassador.
question? Do you believe that for the Montreal Protocol or any of these other initiatives, particularly when it comes to such global issues, when it's not military issues, do you think some of these things would have happened without U.S. leadership? In other words, if we're not there to lead, or if we're not there to participate, would they happen anyway?
Well,
What's your
no, well, it's very hard because we've sort of, even in those, well, even today, we're about 20% of the world's GDP, and maybe even a little bit more, depending how you count. We're such a big player, we have such a large impact on the global economy, given what, just the level of our economic activity. It's hard to imagine these things happening without us. It's not impossible, but it's hard to imagine. And secondly, I think there's more commitment in our society to accomplishing these kinds of things. May not be reflected from one political leadership to another. It may be difficult because of the coal lobby or whatever you want. But I think as a society, as a whole, I think there's a lot of commitment to accomplishing some of these things. I think we've not been as good as we might have been in getting our arms around this issue as a public.
So maybe
and the environmental movement sometimes fails in it. I'll give you an example of why I think that. I think sometimes the environmental people who work exclusively on those issues, they'll say, okay, what are we going to do to help clean up the Caribbean? So the negotiator, the pragmatist says, well, let's have an agreement on plastics, and let's have an agreement on turtle excluders for fishing nets, so that you don't trap a lot of porpoises or turtles or porpoises in. And you maybe negotiate separate agreements on each of these things. Sometimes the environmentalists' reaction, at least it was in my time, was, well, let's just declare the whole Caribbean a national park, and let's just forbid economic activity, right? Make it a pristine, and and I think the concept has got to be rational use. The difficulty is, then how do you define that, and how do you get countries and people to agree as to what constitutes rational use? But you can't ban economic activity in a whole area of the ocean. You can do some of it, the sanctuaries and stuff like that. It's an interesting question. I mean, and the oceans are a mess. Have you seen some of these movies about what plastic is doing to the oceans? Huh? Really?
So that's a segue into the future, and I want to make sure we cover that for these next generation of leaders. And I sense this is an issue where the environment, where you would project forward, and what are your views 5 years out? What are the issues in the environment, or if you want to switch to another issue, that this generation should prepare themselves be ready for, to think about?
Right.
What's your advice?
Okay, well, just staying with environment for a minute, but we ought to move on. We ought to touch on a couple of other issues as well. But on the environment, whether it's going, the Paris Climate Accord was not a panacea. It's not the perfection. What bothered me about withdrawing from it the way the administration did is it sends the wrong kind of signal. It sends a signal that it's okay not to be interested in these kinds of questions. And then that's not only to our own society, but it sends it to other countries. So then you get, people who may not be particularly responsible leaders in country X, Y, or Z. They say, well, if Trump did it, why can't I? If the Americans do it, why can't I? And so then all of a sudden you kind of threaten whatever consensus might have existed to do something about these questions. So if I were president, if I were elected, or if I were Secretary of State, I would advocate going back to Paris or some form thereof, and then try to, frankly, initiate some more concrete negotiations about specific issues as to how to deal with. So that's on the environmental front. But geopolitically, we're going to have some big issues in the next decades. I think probably foremost among them is the United States' relationship with China and what to do about it. I mean, I went to China in June of '72 with Dr. Henry Kissinger after we had a summit in Moscow between Nixon and Brezhnev, and then we went to China, Dr. Kissinger and his team, to explain to the Chinese what we'd discussed in Moscow. And at that time, the country was poor. It had no economy to speak of. We didn't have any trade with China yet because we didn't have relations. It wasn't until 1979 that we opened diplomatic relations with China and lifted the economic embargo in that country. We used to debate in the State Department in 1979, what are we going to import from these people? And that sounds like a ludicrous question today, because I think the question today is, what don't we import from China? And but that's only one of the issues we have with China. I think we also have the issue of reckoning with the fact that they have grown and become this incredible economy that they are in an extremely short period of time. I mean, it's surprisingly quickly. And they're starting to flex their muscles in a whole variety of ways. So we have before us, over the next generation, I think, and your generation is going to definitely be involved in this. You have no way of avoiding a debate about our relationship with China. And are they going to be adversaries? Are they going to be competitors? Are they going to be rivals? Do we want to decouple our economies or not? I mean, some of this we got to discuss in more detail in the course, but I mean, it's those kinds of issues that I think we're going to have to delve into and not try to answer them all right away, but let's establish some kind of a framework for our thinking about China, because the main issue at hand, I think, is, will we decouple and have them become a sort of an implacable rival? Or will we find some way to isolate our differences, manage them as best we can, but then pursue in other areas, avenues of cooperation so that we can try to deal with some of the global issues that we confront together in partnership? Is climate change going to be easier to deal with if we have completely decoupled our respective economies? I don't know. But those kinds of questions. So that's probably one of a number of these important issues, but I think it's probably the most important one.
Okay, so the environment, climate change, China, are there other issues over the horizon that you want to mention?
I mean, there's some, trade is always an issue, a key element of diplomacy, and we're always on tenterhooks about whether the next trade agreement is going to get through the Congress. We're waiting right now to see what happens to the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. We're sort of pending what's going to happen in the trade discussions with China. what's our economic relationship going to be with Europe? We're trying to discuss, negotiate a new trade agreement there. And the president, the other thing he did when he took office in 2017 was the very same day that he withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement, he withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was the trade agreement between 12 East Asia Pacific countries, including ourselves, and kind of leaving us without an economic strategy towards that part of the world, and sort of giving a gift to China in terms of a big opening to them. So I think that's something that we're going to have to deal with. But people who work in diplomacy and national security over the next generation are not going to lack for things to do, Ed. We didn't solve all the problems. I'm afraid we've left them more problems than we had when we started.
And I think that's the opportunity before those who would sign up for your course in this master's degree to help.
I guess
work
thank
through
God
those
we ended
issues.
the Cold War.
We did.
But you notice none of these problems really go away, do they? You have the Cuban Missile Crisis, and our relationship with Cuba is still an issue. You have the war in El Salvador gets solved by a peace agreement, and the Nicaragua, they had democratic elections, and yet the situation in Central America is probably as problematic as it ever has been. And we got a NAFTA agreement with Mexico and Canada, which I think was very good and has been very positive, and we're trying to get through a revised version of the NAFTA. And yet, look at the problems that the country of Mexico is struggling with today. I mean, with unprecedented levels of narcotics-related violence, for example, and then migratory issues, not only Mexicans themselves, that's kind of slowed down and stabilized, but the migratory flow from Central America and elsewhere coming through the country. So, in a way, you never, and maybe it's an important lesson of diplomacy, you never completely solve these problems. You deal with them, you manage them. I mean, there are a lot of them you manage as best you can. If you're lucky, every now and then you really solve one and put it away. But that's the exception. I think the rule is issue management, really, in one way, shape, or form.
Great advice. I want to give you a chance to ask questions. Who has a question for Ambassador Negroponte about anything he said or something you're more interested in that you may not have mentioned?
Yes, sir.
Yes, back here.
Thank you. I'm Pedro Pizarro. I'm a fellow here. Thank you. Hi, I'm Pedro Pisano. I'm a fellow here at the McCain Institute. You touched a little bit upon this, but I wanted to ask you more about it. Given your pivotal role in NAFTA, I was wondering if you could speak a little more about how that was at that time, the successes that it brought forth, and if you could give us an analysis of the MCA, of the Mexico-Canada agreement, and what you see happening. Thank you.
Well, as quickly as I can do that. Here's the interesting part that I was able to see from on the ground in Mexico. I got there in June or July of 1989. In other words, at the beginning of the Bush 41 administration. I was his nominee for Mexico. And then all these things started happening in Eastern Europe and with the former Soviet republics and everything else. And so by January, February of 1990, things had started to change dramatically in Eastern Europe. And President Carlos Salinas of Mexico went to the World Economic Forum in Davos, which takes place every year in January, Davos, Switzerland. And he came back from that meeting, he told me and others, he said, I saw all these Central European leaders in Davos talking to all these investors and saying that now the situation was going to open up, the Soviet Union is collapsing, and we're going to open up to foreign investment, and we're here to invest. We're open for investment. We're open for business. And Salinas said, "My goodness, I'm going to have to do something to make Mexico more competitive with the other countries of the world. I can't count on some sort of a monopoly relationship with the United States in terms of investing in less developed countries." And so he asked me, actually, through his chief of staff, on a trip that I took in February of that year to take the message to President Bush that he was interested in a NAFTA. Secretary Baker and I briefed the president on that for about an hour. We talked for about a whole hour and 55 minutes. The president never said a word. He just listened to us. And then at the end of the 55 minutes, he looked at us and he said, okay. That's all he said. Okay. Go ahead. Well, that's what you need a president for, to say okay, not to equivocate. And a couple of years later, we ended up signing the NAFTA. Ambassador Carla Hills negotiated it. And basically the NAFTA took us from our prior approach with Mexico, which had been to do sector by sector, which, as you can well imagine, is a prescription for negotiating eternally about trade, right? First we'll do automobiles, then we'll do electronics, then we'll do, you can imagine how prolonged that process can be. It's sort of, the NAFTA reverses it. Everything's free unless you actually identify a specific exception, right? That's the rule in a free trade agreement. And so that's what we got. And it's worked pretty well. It's quadrupled the level of trade between us and Mexico. It's brought, I think, helped the Mexican middle class grow substantially. And it's created jobs in this country, too. I don't think it's fair to say that it's cost us. The new agreement, I think the big change is in the automobile sector, where the North American content requirements have been raised by a few percentage points. I think it's gone from the low 60s to the low 70s or something like that. Cars having to be built, all the parts and everything else having to be in the aggregate at least 70% North American. And then there are a few things to do with the digital economy, which didn't exist really back in 1990, 91, 92. A few things about intellectual property, but the main thing was the automobile sector. So it's interesting because the president calls NAFTA the worst agreement ever negotiated, and he calls the USMCA the best. And a lot of people strain to find the difference between the two, although there are some. And let's just take it and get it as quickly as we can. Mrs. Pelosi has said, she said last week, I think it was last week, yeah, that it's up to her to put it to a vote now in the House, and she said that was imminent. But I'm just hoping that really does happen. I think there's a chance, there's a window for it to happen in the next few weeks. If it gets dragged into the election year too far, I think then it might get caught up in politics, and we'd have to wait until a new administration.
Okay. One last question for.
And that would be a pity. Yeah.
Ryan. Good.
Hi, my name is Ryan Madsen. I'm a PDS student, policy design student here at the McCain Institute. I was wondering, just based on your experience, there's been a rise of extremism and a lot of autocratic tendencies in some governments around the world, more so than in a long time in history. And I was kind of wondering, in your experience, what you see that challenge looking like down the road from a foreign policy and international relations perspective.
Right, that's a great question. And again, I think that's one of the advantages of a course like this, because we can try to put some of these issues in perspective. Because even though what I think you're saying is, I believe what you're saying is correct, particularly if you compare it with, say, the last couple of decades or so. I think things have deteriorated. But, when I came in to government, virtually every country in Latin America had authoritarian leadership. Not absolutely every country, but virtually every country. All uniformed military and, all that kind of stuff. And if you could say anything about Latin America in the ensuing years under Kennedy and the Alliance for Progress, and then Carter, and even Reagan, there was a lot of progress on the democratic front. So, and Africa, I think, in many respects, has perhaps become more democratic, at least in certain countries. And some of these regional institutions, I think, have become Some have become more effective, some less so. I think the Organization of American States is having a hard time being effective, whereas I think, for example, the African Union is doing pretty well, to my pleasant surprise. I don't know, you all can validate that for me at some point. If you're in the course, we can talk about it. So I think it's a mixed bag. The issue for American policy, which is a different issue, is in what way should our government advocate for human rights abroad? And to what lengths are we prepared to go in demonstrating our disapproval of country X, Y, or Z because of its political system? And how do we avoid what ends up being sort of a huge hypocrisy of saying, well, you pick on country X because it's small and defenseless and happens to have an authoritarian regime, but you know, in a bigger country that produces a lot of oil and cuts people's hands off for stealing something, you don't do anything, right? So, you know, what's the logic of our human rights policy? And that's something I very much look forward to discussing with students. And how should we go about it? Now, you know, I'm a realist, right? Like Henry Kissinger is a realist. But in the United States, you can't be a realpoliticien and, you know, survive, pass muster with our Congress, with our press, with our people. You have to do something about human rights. But I think there's still a lot of room for discussion about what exactly and how you should go about it. It's not an easy question at all.
That's a challenge for the future for your generation, Ryan, and everybody here. Please join me in thanking Ambassador Negroponte for being with us.
Well, I hope to see some of you next year.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank our Dr. Negroponte and Mr. O'Donnell for having this very exciting conversation that sort of foreshadows for you the kind of conversations we plan to have in all of our classes. Taught by practitioners about practical things that affect our future in an international world that's becoming smaller, not larger, where the encapsulating of national interest is simply not going to be an option for the future. We want to go ahead and explore those things and come to, through critical thinking, arrive at some important thoughts and initiatives and commitment on your generation's part to go ahead and take us to a better future than we are currently able to envision. The motto of our master's degree is serve a greater cause, preparing to serve a greater cause. John McCain was all about serving a greater cause, even if it was to his political detriment. And we want to go ahead and keep that spirit alive by hopefully inspiring a new generation of leaders to go ahead and take the world into a better place. Please join us downstairs for some refreshments. We thank you for coming today. Go spread the word, and we look forward to seeing you here in January and in the summer and in the fall when our courses will be online. Thank you very much.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we'll think about that. Are you a foreign service officer also? Are you?